What's up, guys? Ben here, bringing you another video today. Starting off our preseason or season preview series with the two teams that made it to the grand finals, New York and Toronto. I'm excited to talk about all 12 CDL teams and kind of what they've done over the course of the offseason and where I think they're going to rank during this regular season, what they need to work on, etc., etc. So let's dive in with the two teams that made it all the way to the end and what I think about the stuff that they have done over the course of the offseason. All right, so let's start off with your champions, the New York Subliners. And man, what a season they had with three championships. I don't think anyone would have predicted that at the beginning of the last offseason. If you remember, summer of 2022, we had probably one of our most fun, interesting flank episodes of all time. The New York Vanguard season was a complete cluster F. I'm trying to think of words I could say without having to censor me on this video, but we had New York come on the flank and really talk about how much of a mess that Vanguard team was. And going into last season, they decided to like completely overhaul the team with Hydra and Kizzy, only kind of remaining players on the roster. D-Real was under a little bit of fire after the situation in Vanguard. He stuck around and they brought in a bunch of new faces. Priestahh was coming over from the Minnesota Rocker. Guys coming over from the Florida Mutineers, and Troy Center Michaels coming over from Optic on the coaching front. And, you know, I think the combination of people they had on the team, like everybody had a chip on their shoulder. You know, Hydra had dealt with during that offseason the will he, won't they go to Optic situation where it sounds like, you know, I know Shotzi's talked about it as recent as, you know, recording this this Saturday before the first matches. Like as of a couple of days ago during a BPL stream, Shotzi was talking about how close Hydra was to signing with Optic. Like he was in the group text and all that stuff. So he probably felt some type of way about that whole situation. His obviously has always been sort of an underrated player. So easy to motivate there. Skies had been on an extremely mediocre Florida Mutineers team for about 2 years after their really good performance in Modern Warfare 2019, RIP Pharaoh. And then Priestahh, and I, you know, Preston's my boy, but he had been on that terrible Rocker team in Vanguard. Like they were just, man, they were just really bad. After like being pretty good at the end of the year in Cold War, Vanguard, they were terrible. And people were honestly saying, should he be in the Pro League when he got picked up on this team? And then we just talked about D-Real, obviously, you know, Krim kind of brought in a lot of beef there on the D-Real front. And Sender and the Troy stuff, I think for me, not to get too off topic, was very unwarranted. I feel like every time the coach on Optic gets blamed for things that the players should get blamed for. We're going to talk about that more on my video that will come out tomorrow about Optic. But Troy was under some scrutiny for the lack of results at Huntsman and Optic Texas. And, you know, ended up with Rambo in the merger, not wanting to play second fiddle, ended up wanting to go somewhere where he, you know, they get a little more control. So everybody had a chip on their shoulder and they got immediate results at Major 1, getting that victory in Raleigh. From there, they kind of reached sort of the valley of their season. Sort of after the New Year's, you know, they played pretty decent online. But going into Major 2, they had travel issues going to the event in Boston, and they got top 8 after winning one match, but they were pretty much a non-factor at that. Major 3, Columbus, or rather, this is not Columbus, this is Dallas, was a poor event for them. They really struggled. And at that point, I think we were having a conversation of, okay, this New York team like peaked too early. Their S&D was really poor. They were super unclutch. Hardpoint, they looked decent, control a little bit, whatever. And we'll get to the stats more in a second. And I really like the work that they put in really over the course of the next like month and a half to get back to where they were. Now, Major 4, they got 4th at Columbus, and I think they probably could have gotten higher if they didn't really blow search against Atlanta FaZe. I mean, that came down, really, that series really came down to the clutches that Abizi had at them on Hotel S&D. And I think that was a big wake-up call because after that, you saw going into Toronto, the work that team was putting in search. They ended up winning Major 5, taking all the S&Ds in the grand final against Atlanta FaZe. And then at COD Champs, they continued that form. I think Toronto was probably the better team on Saturday, and New York had to kind of battle through the loser side versus, once again, Atlanta FaZe. But they pulled up on Sunday and absolutely waxed Toronto, and we'll get to that on the Toronto side of this in a second. But it was like the least close grand final I've ever seen in the COD Champs. There you go, the New York team taking the first, last, and second to last events. They got a lot of prize money, and you would think if you're New York after this season that you just run it back, right? 3 event wins of 6, like, you know, let's keep it moving and grooving and try and go back to back. Instead, they make what I think was in my eyes, a controversial decision to move on from a Priestahh and pick up Sib. Now, I thought that the messaging around the move was very poor. I felt like New York was completely not straight up with the community about the reasons as to why they did it. They were kind of spreading these rumors that it was about money, but it really wasn't about money. And then recently we've heard D-Real talk on a podcast. They felt like they didn't want to miss an opportunity to pack a punch. So I felt like New York just didn't handle this roster move in a particularly good fashion. And I want to take a look at sort of their stats and kind of game mode breakdowns from last season and kind of talk on things I think they need to work on and where I think that bringing in Dante may not necessarily help them on that front. So as always, you see I got my spreadsheets unlocked. You're going to see more of this spreadsheet with the season starting. You know, I love my shout out my guy Turtle for making these spreadsheets. But you look where New York finished at the end of the season, plus a win percentage in all game modes. They were great at hardpoint all year. Control, I think Hotel was definitely helped them out. Once Fortress got out, they were 8-1 to Fortress, and we had a lot of questions about, you know, once Fortress is out, were they going to be one of the teams that are going to get squeezed a little, and they were able to answer that question. And his search record definitely improved a lot by the end of the season, thanks to especially Estilo, S&D on that front. And if we scroll all the way over here, like I scroll all the way down, you could see the improvements kind of in game modes from split to split, right? Like stage 1, they're really good across all game modes. Again, control, really, really good. But you can see that as we got to the middle of the season, you know, the S&D was starting to be a little bit of a problem. And then you see the reverse at stage 3 where, you know, at Dallas and sort of the online matches they played, like they were not great at hardpoint during that split. And so they put in a little bit of work going into the Columbus major and clean up their hardpoint. But again, S&D was still a struggle on that front. They weren't really playing Expo, but the Hotel was helping them out 3-1 there. And then you kind of see the final version of this team here. We look at the major 5 split and great S&D record, only losing 3 searches. Control 500, that's okay when you're winning your game 5s, and 12-7 in a hardpoint is solid. And then if we scroll over to the right, champs record, really good. You can't actually scroll up so you can see it. S&D was a little bit mixy, but still unable to above 500 record there. They were dominant control, didn't lose a Hotel, all of champs, and their S&D was really, really good. And you see when this team's ability to win events, I mean, S&D wins you chips, game 5 ice wins you chips. I mean, it's no secret why this team, you know, as far as their ability to grind out series and win the mixier matches against good teams, this team was able to pull it off. And again, we could scroll through like their win-loss record against top teams. They played Toronto a lot, and yes, not a winning record there, but 3-5 is not too bad. 2-2 against Optic, 4-2 against FaZe, great win percentage there. You see they're taking care of business against some of the bottom teams like Vegas and unfortunately Rocker, LAG, etc., etc., etc. 2-3 against Seattle, interesting, but we'll get to, I think, that more a little bit when we talk about some of where those players have gone, and 2-1 against Thieves. So New York, really good against top teams, really good across all game modes. And it's surprising when you look at that they decided not to run back the same team they had to try and make a change. What do I think about the Sim move they made? One school of thought is, well, teams that don't, you know, that run it back in a situation, you just kind of hard to have the same sort of angle to motivate yourself. And that's for where these teams get in issues, kind of going back to back end up with the roster change. And maybe that was part of some weird superstition on New York's end as to why they made the Preston move. I just think in general, they just saw an opportunity to, in their eyes, get someone who they felt like had a little bit more mechanical skill. I just don't always, and listen, like I get the pack-a-punch thing. I know Aches talks about it. I just think with the way that their team build was, though, that they were then going to put themselves in a very risky situation as far as the way their team sets up. And let me explain, because you go from a roster where Hydra is your aggressive sub player, Skies is your sort of backline AR, and then Kiz and Preston are very flexible players the way in which they play, very unselfish, can run a sub, can run an AR depending on the meta, can be aggressive, can play corners, like they can kind of just play the way they need to play to make the system work. You go into a situation where, you know, when Dante is pretty much put on every team that he's ever been on, amateur or pro level, like he has been kind of the AR focused slayer where they sort of build a team around him. And then Skies is going to be the backline player, but now you're going to run into sort of this, like, you sort of have this disconnect between Kismet and Hydra and the 2 ARs. And so I do think that this is going to probably end up with either Skies or Dante having to change their current playstyle a lot to kind of match the pacing required in this game. Because some of you might say to me, well, Ben, the way that this game looks right now, it's AR heavy, it's slow. I'm telling you, by the way, having watched a lot of pro scrims this year, for some teams, maybe it's slow because they don't trust their ability to break kills. But I'm telling you, the elite teams right now are playing with a lot of pace still on some of these maps. And they are aggressive at old. They're aggressive at new time, rotating at 35. And my concern with a team like New York with Dante coming in is that they're going to need to do a lot of work to kind of develop the sort of single mindset and sort of the their ability to play quickly and have that connectivity to Hydra, who does kind of shot call a lot and they play around him. I think they lose a lot of that with Preston. And by the way, I like Dante. Don't get me wrong. He's a very talented player. I thought was a big reason why Seattle has, won a championship, was a contender in the beginning of the season. But let's not act like Preston was playing poorly. They're getting what they want out of him, to be a 0.95 type of player, to be the glue, to be able to kind of be a flexible player. They're going to have to do a little bit more work with Sib coming in to sort of figure out the chemistry there. So, okay, let's take a look at New York's schedule, and I'll give you kind of my thoughts about where I think they might net Major 1 and then kind of end of the season. So for Major 1 cycle, and just to give kind of a refresher, we're going to have this sort of big break in the middle of the qualifier split. Obviously, if you haven't heard, they're playing 7 games now instead of 5 for every split. So a lot more matches, should be less crazy, ridiculous 3 and 2, 2 and 3 tiebreakers. So New York before the break only have 3 matches. They're going to start off against Optic on that first day on Friday next this upcoming week. Then they play LAG in Vegas. So those are the 3 matches they have before the split. I think, to me, that seems like a 2-1. I think they have a good chance against Optic. We'll talk about them in tomorrow's video, and where I think, just like New York, I think they're going to have a real adaptation period. And LAG and Vegas should be winnable matches for New York. A key emphasis on should be. But then it gets a little bit tricky after the break. They play a Rocker team that Lamar's teams are going to usually be pretty organized in the beginning of the year. So that I don't think is a particularly easy match. And then they have this run-in against Thieves, who I think are, we'll get to them probably in a video later on this weekend, early next week. I think they're going to be a real contender this year. Toronto, who we're going to talk about in a second, who are definitely going to be a good team this year. And then Boston, and potentially might need to win that match, depending on how this shakes out, to really get in the winner's bracket or not have to be like a 7th or 8th seed. So my assessment on New York, based on what I've seen so far in this sort of preseason and scrims, I don't expect New York to go into Boston with a super top seed. That's not to say they're not going to make winner's bracket or get like 4th or 5th seed, because I can definitely see it, especially because I think that these Vegas and LAG games are winnable, and I feel like they can split some of this stretch. But I do think that they are going to get challenged a little bit in this. I'm a little concerned about some of the gameplay I've seen during the split from New York, and so I expect them to have a slower start to the season as compared to last year. But I do think eventually this team is going to figure it out, whether with this team or if they have to make a roster change because it doesn't work. I expect New York come champs time to A, make it to the event, and B, be a factor at that event. I don't know if they're necessarily going to win, because I think that if I had to pick 2 teams right now, it's some combination of me, of Optic, FaZe, and Toronto. But I do think that, you're going to get another MVP style season from Hydra. I think they're going to be like a 4th or a 5th, at least a 4th or a 5th seed. Or higher for champs, and I expect them to be good by the end of the season. But if you're a New York fan, I think the beginning of the year I would temper your expectations, because I think a lot of other teams got better, and I don't know if necessarily this move is going to benefit them to start the season. All right, so let's talk about the other team that was in the grand finals, the one that got Kentucky fried, the Toronto Ultra. They end up actually making a couple of changes. They had a terrible, just like New York, Vanguard was a season to forget. After a really good Cold War season, team was a revelation that year. Just came up short in the grand finals of champs that year. Vanguard was a season to forget. They were just even if I scroll down, you see they were not bad during the Vanguard year. They were top 16, but that was basically it. Outside of what happened at the beginning of the year, where it looked like, they were going to kind of run it back in Vanguard, they were just a non-factor. So going into last year's season, they call up Scrappy from their academy team. A lot of questions about whether or not he was going to perform, back up all his smack talk, and they get Eli Standy over from the Minnesota Rocker. And they get off to a decent start to the season. They looked really good online, but they had this issue at Major 1 and Major 2 where once Saturday rolled around, it all just kind of fell apart for their team at these events. I think Major 2 in particular was the more egregious one, where they looked so good online before that tournament. They looked great on Thursday. And they went 0-6 map count on Saturday to get eliminated. So, and they played like one match after they got back during the Major 3 cycle and decided to make a roster change, releasing, well, they benched Eli Standy and then eventually released him. And they brought up Charlie Hixie from substitute spot. And immediately they found success. They pulled up to that Dallas event and got it done beating Optic in the finals and continued to be a pretty good team. The next couple of events, I think, you know, they had some difficulties at that Columbus event. And we'll kind of take a look at the stats and I'll kind of show you why. And then at the Toronto event, you know, I didn't think they played particularly bad at that event. I think they were just more so a product of like, I think their worst matchup the last couple of years has really been against teams like Atlanta FaZe, and that's kind of where they've struggled. And you saw that kind of at the Toronto Major. So going into champs, they were a top 4 seed, which, you know, could have been a little bit better, but they were, you know, you had seen online and you know, from Major 3 on that there was, once this team kind of got in their window and got going, that they could be really good. And they were fantastic pretty much the first 3 days of champs. They looked like, to me, the team that was the one that was going to win. And then Sunday happened. And I don't really, you know, it's funny because like right after the event on Sunday, you know, we went back to our hotel. I went out to the courtyard. I'll be honest, I had had a few drinks at that point. You know, we went to the Mexican restaurant, me and Tom, and we went I'm just telling a little bit of a side story here. Got food with a bunch of people. And then I came in the courtyard and like the Toronto boys were just kind of hanging out. And I kind of talked to them and they were just sort of like, yeah, like, I don't, there was just, they were very professional about it. You know, they weren't like melting down, but it was just like, very bizarre to them that they just had an egg on Sunday. And look, I think, to be honest, like, it happens, you know, their biggest competition, Atlanta FaZe, and we'll talk about it in the next video, like, are a team that's had an issue closing out events. Optic Texas has had an issue closing out events. LA Thieves last season has had some issues closing out events. Like, you get to a certain point where skill gets you to a consistent level, but you got to finish on Saturday and Sunday. And I think that was the biggest issue with their team last year. They had a very interesting offseason. Where to begin? So champs ends, everybody goes home. And then immediately it seems like management starts making unilateral decisions about the roster. Scrap came on our streams, I want to say like a week and a half ago, talking about how, like, you know, he thought it was just him and Hixie left on the roster at one point. The next Insight got dropped. You know, there were a lot of rumors about Scrap wanting to maybe leave the team. I think then eventually everybody started talking to each other, management and the players, and they're like, well, we're being really stupid collectively as a group here. So they decide to run it back with one slight twist. They end up parting ways with Charlie Hixie, and Envoy from LA Thieves becomes available and they bring him in. If I have to rate that move for Toronto, that's an A-level move for me. I like Charlie. I think if you watch what he did on the minimap last season, that guy was making the right play. The only knock you could really have on Hixie was just gun skill, like pure like skill ability to win ones was limited compared to other players at that level. And I'm talking like the top levels, not like, you know what I mean? Because I think Hixie is definitely a CDL caliber player, and I'm a little disappointed he didn't get on the roster this season. But for the Toronto team, I think to get a little bit more consistency outside of being, basically, if you look at this placing, like they placed top 4 pretty much every event. They had 2 final appearances and a couple top 6s. I think they want to make it a little bit deeper on Sundays. And so for them, bringing in an Envoy who has a little bit more skill, a world champ, can kind of play the same way as Hixie. You know, he can run an AR, know he can run a sub, you know, he can communicate. Like, to me, it was a no-brainer move for Toronto, and I absolutely love that move. And I think, to me, it's going to cement a little bit more consistency, believe it or not, for this Toronto squad. And that's really been the issue this season, or last season. If you look at these stats for Toronto, first off, they were probably the best, if not one of the best, you know, control teams in the game. If we go and click over here, you're going to see that they had the highest win percentage in control last season by a large margin, with still a lot of games getting played. Like, they were nasty at the game mode, and it kind of helped them close out series. Like, if I scroll over here and you take a look at, you know, their game 4 ability, like they were closing out 6 out of 10 of them, but they were getting in trouble as game 5s, but we'll get to that in a second. They're giving themselves a good chance in the first 4 games of any series. But I think where the consistency could have gotten a little bit better, one was S&D. You know, I think that at times when they would have to play like in a CeeLo S&D, Mercado would get banned on them and they got to play hotel. It was less of a 60, 40, 65, 35 or so on kind of percentage some of the better teams had. they really were in more of a 50-50 situation, especially in game 5. Their hard point was really, really good, but they did have, 2 maps in their pool that they were solid-ish at. Hydro got better than them a lot. These guys were nasty at Hydro. They were great on Mercado and then Hotel, but you see that they were just sort of always floating around the 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 thing. And I think if we kind of take a look at event by event, what happens when you're sort of in that box, and most teams are because it's hard to be dominant in all game modes, you're just kind of dependent on whether or not it's going to kind of click. And that's why you saw them struggle sometimes on the weekends, because you look at stage 1 and you're like, wow, how do these guys now make it to the grand final at that event? Well, they just had a couple of series on the weekend where this just didn't click. Major 2, again, you see that they're floating just around the 500-ish number. Stage 3, this is obviously the dominant one, the control. You're gonna see this is a common theme. Teams that win events were good at control last year. You would think the S&D wins ships, and it does, but control, being dominant control is very helpful. You see they were really good at hardpoint. They had a couple maps where they were undefeated during the split that they won once they had they won this big win streak after they dropped Sandy. Then going in the last 2 events of the season, you see that at Columbus they really struggled with search, and that's why they really just did not make it deep in that tournament. And then this was a weird one to me, was the whole around the Toronto event. They were just terrible for about 2 or 3 weeks in hardpoint during the split, but they were also insane at control, so it was keeping them in some of these series, but you see that they were just not really consistent enough, even though their search was good. And then you get the champs, and I think these stats are a little bit skewed because of how bad they got fried in the finals, but they pulled up to this event for the most part. Were looking dominant in hard point, good in control, and then they just kind of ran into that buzzsaw. They lost 1 series, and this is sort of the tough thing in the champs format. They had 1 bad series the whole weekend. It's the one that counted the most in the grand finals. So just, I think for Toronto, you look at these stats, and they were clearly like a top 4 team last year, but their hope is bringing in Envoy will, I think, make these numbers and bring them more consistency from a stage to stage basis. And I think make the valleys less severe, which was a little bit of their issue last season. They had to make a roster change and they figured it out, but I think adding Envoy is going to make this team kind of final. All right, so let's take a look at who they have for the Major 1 qualifiers, and then I'll kind of give you my short-term, long-term thoughts. So they have got what I would say a very easy schedule off the rip. They play LAG, Carolina, and Boston all before the holiday break. To me, I think there's a very good chance this Toronto team will go 3-0. I think if you are someone who is a bettor, you could probably get some pretty good value in this series. This might be the closest to me of the 3. I think Toronto's always matched up pretty good against Boston. Maybe LAG, you might get some good value. Toronto's doing a watch party for this first event, and last year they lost that first match of the season, so there's some value there. But I expect if it were in a vacuum, the chances of them going 3-0 here are pretty solid. After the break, they do have a little bit of some challenge here. Seattle, who I think will actually be pretty decent off the start this year, and we'll talk about them in a couple videos. LA Thieves, New York, and Vegas. So I think looking at this schedule for Toronto, I think there's a very good chance they're going to end this with 1, maybe 2 losses, and will be a top seed going into Boston. I expect in general this season for Toronto, for them, barring a complete collapse and people really underperforming from where they were last season. To me, Toronto, I think will go from a top 4 to a top 3 team all season. I think them and FaZe are the 2 teams to me that are most positioned to be really consistent this year. And I think Toronto will go from, 2 grand final appearances to maybe 3 this year. I know we only have 5 events, but I really honestly believe this Toronto team is built right now. And the fact that you've got a year extra experience under Scrap's belt, he kind of knows how to navigate things. Kleenex and Inside have been around for a while. I know we haven't talked a lot about them in this video, but those guys are fantastic top players. I just think this Toronto team is positioned to be a really good team this year, and one of my favorites for pretty much probably every event this season. Yeah, those are kind of my thoughts. I think in general, to kind of wrap my thoughts on both teams, really surprised in New York made a change this offseason, and I think it's a risk, and we'll see if it pays off. I think we need to be patient with them, because I think it's not as easy of a plug and play move as what Toronto did. Bringing in Envoy for Hixie I don't think it takes much adjustment on the Toronto end, even on top of all the things that come across having to deal with the new game. So I'm more optimistic about Toronto in this first stage than I am New York. I do think New York will be a contender by the end of the year, by the middle of the year. To me, if I had to pick top 3 teams, top 2 teams in the league right now, I think Toronto is going to be in that conversation for sure. So let me know what you guys thought of this video in the comments. Like, if you enjoyed, subscribe for more. We're doing the other 10 teams. I think you guys will like the next one. The next 2 teams we're going to cover is going to be Atlanta FaZe and Optic Texas. So we'll see you guys on the next one.